Okay, it's 12:05, so it's time for us to start our today's lecture. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Yulia Ivanuk and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the university campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on the territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Our today's lecture is Westbound, Ukraine's place in the European and Euro-Atlantic space. Please note that the lecture will be video recorded and posted on the Center's social media pages. After Maksym's presentation, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. Please indicate in the comment section if you have a question and I'll call on you, or feel free to type your question and I'll happily read it out for you. So about our presenter. Maksym Panchenko is a graduate of the Kiev Institute of International Relations. He currently works as an analyst and journalist at the NGO Internews Ukraine and in Ukraine World, where he specializes in Ukraine's European integration and broader foreign policy. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Maksym Panchenko.
Thank you very much, Yulia. I hope everybody can hear me well. If not, please indicate me at any moment, and I will try to adjust things as far as it is possible. Yes, so I'm very glad to meet everybody, and I'm very honored that somebody is willing to listen to me this evening when the rest of the world is currently listening to what Joe Biden has to say to the rest of the world to say. And so yes, that is a bit flattering. So thank you very much. As it was said, my name is Maksym Panchenko, and I work at NGO Internews Ukraine, based in Kiev. Just to give you a notion of what we regularly do, there are several things, several tracks we're following. So the first one is that a part of our team is working as a think tank on the EU-related issues, and in that capacity, we also provide our services to the EU delegation to Ukraine, and also we publish our materials dedicated to that matter, to the relations between the EU and Ukraine, to the dynamics, to the problems, to the summits that are taking place, and for instance, to the forthcoming association council that is going to take place just in a few weeks' time, and things like that. Secondly, we have our own online resource, which is a flagship project of the NGO I'm working at, and it is called ukraineworld.org. It basically aims to tell the world and to explain the world what Ukraine essentially is, the bare bones of its politics, the societal issues, economics, foreign policy, and so on and so forth. Judging from what I heard, judging from what I was prepared upon by Yulia before this meeting, I think that this may be the resource that you would like to follow up on, to research a bit, because I think there are many publications that would go into detail on different matters concerning Ukraine. So I strongly encourage you to visit the page, and I think I will also leave the respective information, the contacts to Yulia, and so that you know where to refer to. And thirdly, which maybe does not have that much to do with what we're talking about today, but still this is a very important part of our work, is that we deal with disinformation, particularly in current circumstances, disinformation that comes from the Russian Federation, because we have an ongoing war, and also disinformation that is connected with the pandemic of the coronavirus. This includes the conspiracy theories and the different campaigns against European or American vaccines and for Russian vaccines and so on and so forth. So there is, if you're into that kind of thing when it comes to your research interests, so yes, of course, feel free to refer to our expertise. So just several ground rules for, not rules, just things I would like to mention before I refer to my topic is that I decided not to have any presentation because presentation as a PPT presentation, because I did not want anything to hamper our face-to-face connection. So, and also, while I'm speaking, please feel free to write, as Giva already said, your questions into the chat section. As long as I see them, I maybe will try to adjust my narrative so that I will be able to include my answers to those questions into my narrative. And if not so, I promise you that I will answer them after I'm finished with my presentation. But generally, I encourage you to be very active, because I would very much like not just to speak, but to interact, to understand your side of things, and to respond to your questions. So now referring to the topic that I'm going to talk about today, Westbound, Ukraine's place in the European and Euro-Atlantic space. The very wording of this topic suggests that Ukraine has a choice to be westbound, eastbound, to choose its vector, and which is why before I go into detail, well, the majority of today's presentation is going to be dedicated to the events that happened in Ukraine since 2014, since the Revolution of Dignity, and since Ukraine became quite unequivocal in its choice of foreign policy course. But before that, I would like to put things a little bit into perspective and to analyze them from the historical point of view, why the westbound narrative that I'm going to be talking about today is not well, it is not something that is already decided. It is. I would like to speak about it as just a momentum that is taking place now, and how it may evolve, and so on and so forth. So, what choices does Ukraine generally have when it comes to choosing a foreign policy agenda? So usually and historically, this is either being eastbound, which means that Ukraine would be oriented on Moscow, and in Ukrainian history, this happened quite a number of times. It means that Ukraine can be westbound, and in history, Ukraine's being westbound meant different things. For instance, 100 years ago, this referred to the west of Ukraine. There were these regimes that were emerging after the First World War. The world was reshaped, and so on and so forth. Now, these days, and in the context of this presentation, when we speak about being westbound, we speak about Ukraine's being trying to affiliate itself with liberal democracies and becoming a liberal democracy itself. So these days, Ukraine's choice between East and West is basically a choice between going liberal and a choice and going to the East, which means pretty much authoritarian, because when you deal with this type of regimes that we have to the east, and Ukraine in its independence history also has the record of regimes we maybe not that much used to calling them authoritarian, but still this is something that resembles the East tradition of politics more than the West tradition of politics. Of course, there is also an option to become self-reliant, to become neutral, and to not to choose to go either liberal or authoritarian, just to stay. You know, some pundits have usually said before the war that it would not be a bad option, because they said there are different factions within Ukraine that are going to. Several factions are going to say that, okay, let's go eastbound. Several are going to say, let's go westbound, and this is going to make Ukraine torn apart. And they were saying that maybe let's just become neutral, and that will be the solution to the problem. However, the problem is that, and there is some, as they say, tough love coming in. Ukraine has a record of not being able to overcome some of the challenges when it comes to unity, and this may not be the most particularly pleasant thing to admit, but if we look back at, for instance, the events that happened 300 years ago, when we were talking about the national liberation movement under Khmelnytsky, and the official record of history is that Khmelnytsky chose to go to affiliate himself with Russia eventually, but history also says that no, not everybody was agreeing with that. If we look at the developments that took place 100 years ago, we can see that Ukraine had several consecutive regimes that changed one another in the course of just a couple of years. And they were pretty much different in their foreign policy orientation. For instance, when we speak about the Directorate, yes, or when we speak about the Hetman Skoropadsky, who was oriented towards the German Empire at that time, and so on and so forth. So and these regimes, these Ukrainian regimes that changed each other, they were hostile between themselves. I mean, they pushed each other from the power and became the power themselves, which entails the thought about the lack of unity, the inherent lack of unity in Ukrainian society. This is something that also transpired quite actively after Ukraine gained independence in 1991 too, because there has been a consistent narrative which may have become somewhat less after the beginning of the war, but still there was classically this east of Ukraine versus west of Ukraine. There were these stereotypes about the ones not liking the others, and so on and so forth. And so yes, this is something we are very much dealing with even now. As I said, maybe after the beginning of the war in 2014, this became somewhat of a less transparent tendency, because well, when a country, when a neighboring country is assaulting your country, so this does not provide for enough justification to be for the East to be pro-Eastern or pro-Russian, for instance. So this, I think, and the common foreign enemy, this contributed to Ukraine's unity in the face of the enemy. But other than that, the stereotype, unfortunately, continues to live up to these days. So the next thing I would like to say is that also carrying on the issue of unity, there is if we take a theoretical approach, there is this classical statement by Samuel Huntington, who I think you're all acquainted with in terms of his works. He stated in his work, The Clash of Civilizations, that there are countries, there are nations, rather to say, that are inherently torn apart in themselves because their parts belong to different civilizations, and together, being in the company of some just several nations around the globe, Ukraine is also one, according to Huntington, is also such a country, such a nation, which explains from the theoretical point of view, from the civilizational point of view, why Ukraine's neutrality is not the best option. Ukraine needs to rely on somebody, and to, well, maybe not to rely on somebody, but to align with somebody, to have an unequivocal foreign policy course, because figuring out things oneself, yes, Ukraine does not necessarily is not necessarily an effective thing. Apart from that, neutrality is not a good option because Ukraine is at the crossroads of geopolitics. It is, as unpleasant as it may be to admit, Ukraine is not only a subject but also an object of foreign policy of other states. It is situated, first of all, near the boundary of NATO and Russia. It is in the crossfire between NATO and Russia, which makes it a frontier that can turn into a frontier of war. So Ukraine, when this clash between Russia and NATO happens, if it happens, Ukraine will be in crossfires, and being non-affiliated with anybody may play against Ukraine itself. Apart from that, Ukraine is also a former Cold War outpost. Again, if we speak about the Cold War players, there were the USSR and the US, and now there is and there has been for a good portion of time growing standoff between Russia and the US. And Ukraine is one of the countries of interest for both of these countries. For Russia, because it needs a belt of countries to protect itself from the outer world, from the liberal world, from NATO, but also from the US, which, even though it may be over the pond, it still is the major bloc of that NATO that is threatening Russia. And of course, there is the issue of Crimea, because US is exploiting, in the best of senses, exploiting this example as an instrument that, hey, we will not let you, Russia, make things like you did with Crimea, encroach on the territorial integrity of sovereign states, and we, as a global guardian, are not going to let that happen wherever in the world that happens. And this is why Ukraine is a territory of contention between Russia and the United States. So what I'm telling you is that Ukraine is at the crossroads in very many senses, and this does not make neutrality very good, and Ukraine needs to align itself with a foreign policy power. Now, if we look around and we exclude this independent self-reliance course, we then should exclude the eastbound course because it is no longer available after 2014. So what Ukraine is left with is going westbound, is going towards Brussels and going towards Washington. It is going towards the European Union and NATO, as well as Washington as in the US, because US is also a very self-sufficient and big partner of Ukraine. Ukraine may have had hard times in its bilateral relations with the US in its recent history, under the recent administration in the United States, but I'll go into that detail a bit later. So the next thing I'm going to refer to is the domestic agenda. How Ukraine's westboundness, if I would, how it is perceived in Ukraine, and how political forces in Ukraine are accepting this. So it should be understood that Ukraine's decision to unequivocally go west, it coincided in time with Ukraine's obtaining its new authorities, its new president, its new parliament, almost immediately in the wake of the outbreak of hostilities in the east of Ukraine. So it can be quite unequivocally said that there were, for a good amount of time, and up to this day pretty much, not many contentions about domestic agenda. Should we or should we not go west? So Panchenko made European integration and made Ukraine's Western course the cornerstone on his politics, the cornerstone of his popularity in Ukraine and also internationally. It should be understood that immediately after, well, if you remember why the Euromaidan happened initially and why the hostilities broke out in the east of Ukraine, this was all tied to the question of Ukraine's signature of the association agreement with the European Union. And because Yanukovych, the ousted president, refused to sign that agreement in November 2013. There was the Euromaidan, there was this Russian aggression, and all the developments that we know happened after 2013, 2014. So when he came to power, the first things Poroshenko did and was expected to do. That's why he was elected. He made sure that those things that had not been eventually signed with the EU, that they were signed. So this situation played into his hands, which is why it was very convenient for him to have basically no opposition to what he was doing regarding the western course of Ukraine. So he signed the association agreement, first the political section and a little bit later the economic section. He contributed to Ukraine's obtainment of the visa-free regime on, if I'm not mistaken, on June 11th, 2017. So for 3.5 years now and running. So these were the major, the cornerstone things that he contributed to. And then when he ceased to be president, when he lost the next presidential election to President Zelensky, he kept using this image of the Euro integrator, despite the corruption issues that may have been revolving around President Poroshenko. He still was betting on this Euro-integrational image so much. He was very pathetic in his rhetoric. He was citing the Russian and Ukrainian classics that, we're going west, that we're, there are classical lines just in Ukrainian and Russian literature that say, like, go to Europe, and we're going to Europe, and we're going away from Moscow. And these are some pathetic lines. And so he was using that. And this is how he came to Parliament where he is now. And he used this moment not just to go to Parliament himself. He also rebranded his party that had previously been the party in his name while he was an incumbent president. He had the Solidarity Party, the bloc, the Petro Poroshenko bloc, which was the Solidarity Party. That was the double name. And once he became the MP, he rebranded it into the European Solidarity Party. And the interesting thing is that in Ukrainian language, the European Solidarity, the abbreviation of the European Solidarity Party, yes, is the same one that is for the European Union, yes, which only emphasized how much of a Euro integrator he wanted to be perceived in Ukraine. Anyway, when he was replaced by President Zelensky, that was kind of a different pair of shoes, because of course President Zelensky, the main thing about him is that he was pathetic enough, he was willing enough, but he was not experienced enough. So everybody held their breath in Ukraine and abroad about whether Ukraine will continue its westbound course. And because there were fears that Zelensky, during his electoral campaign, Zelensky was so vociferous about his desire to sit down to the table of negotiations with Putin, with his confidence that he would be able to convince Putin to stop the war in the east of Ukraine, and in his confidence that he would be able. He himself, Zelensky, would be able to bring hostilities to an end and to become the victorious president who has stopped the bloodshed and so on and so forth. So not everybody was quite sure that he would be pro-European. But it later turned out that these fears had more to do with his inexperience than bad intentions. Because, and maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but later it turned out that he was, during many of his foreign visits, especially to the European institutions and to the European governments, to the European states, he was emphasizing, guys, we need a specific instruction, what we need to do, what we need to follow to become an EU member state. And even though, and rightfully so, this is a very naive approach to the situation, it still is soothing to know that that Zelensky is that much pro-European. So it should be also emphasized that the way European and Euro-Atlantic issues are being dealt under President Zelensky administration, this way is a bit different from the one that was under Poroshenko administration. This is because Poroshenko came to power, as I previously mentioned, based on this narrative that I'm going to bring you back to Europe, where to Europe, which you just have been stolen from by Yanukovych, who did not sign the association agreement. So this was his major ace up his sleeve. However, Zelensky, when he came to power, he said, guys, when I'm going to become president, the primary thing I'm going to be dealing with is the hostilities in the East. And the other things are not going to be bothering me that very much. So there was a shift in the responsibilities, that now the core institution and the core office that is being responsible for Ukraine's European and Euro-Atlantic integration is the office of the Deputy Prime Minister of the European and Euro-Atlantic integration. That's the long and full title of the person who is occupying that office. Ukraine has been lucky so far that now that we're having the third person occupying this office, every of these three people have been very devout Atlanticists, if that's the word. Yes, the word, very devout to the idea of Euro-Atlantic integration. First, that was Vladimir Staiko, who then became Ukraine's foreign minister and then became Ukraine's ambassador to Great Britain, where he is now incumbent. Then there was Dmytro Kuleba, who is now Ukraine's foreign minister. And then there is Mrs. Olha Stefanishina, who is incumbent right now. So it is important to understand that even though, my major idea, that even though it seems that the issue of Ukraine's European integration and Euro-Atlantic integration has been handed down from the president all the way to the deputy prime minister, it no way means that this agenda became any less important in Ukraine's foreign policy. That still is the cornerstone and the lens that Ukraine's foreign ministry and other institutions are looking at the outer world. So that's a thing to keep in mind. And if we are looking at the landscape, that is probably the last thing I'm going to say in this section on the domestic agenda. If we're looking at the media, at the perception of media and society in Ukraine regarding the European and Euro-Atlantic integration, there are two things to be mentioned. First of all, the numbers of those who are in favor of Ukraine's being westbound is growing. This is something that is shown to us by the results of the regular sociological surveys. The last one that I saw dated back from the mid-November 2020, and it said that about 49% of Ukrainians wanted Ukraine to become an EU member state, and I think that was 40. I may check this now, but I think 40-something% wanted Ukraine to become a NATO member state, which and the numbers are growing, which demonstrates that there is still some way to go. This is not unanimous, but the tendencies are playing in the hands of those who promote Ukraine's European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Also, it should be said that these same sociological surveys, they demonstrate that Ukraine, the different regions of Ukraine, they perceive this integration in different ways. The Western and Central regions, they are all in favor. Numbers there have skyrocketed long ago. And when it comes to Southern and Eastern regions, these still are the regions that tend to have a greater share of those who want to integrate with the integration projects launched by Moscow, both when it comes to security and when it comes to economics, which kind of a positive thing, because those are, especially when it comes to the Eastern regions, not Southern, these are the regions that were affected by the hostilities involving Russia. But still, they still are a great share of people from there consider going eastbound. So that's a very interesting thing and kind of worrisome. So yes, and the last thing is that if you look at Ukrainian media, and there is a variety of actors when it comes to being westbound: EU, NATO, US, Canada. But almost all the headlines are filled with exclusively European Union, with Brussels and so on and so forth. The second place is being held by, I think, NATO. The third place is being held by the US. And just to put this into a bit of a perspective, I think you know that Ukraine and Canada has a free trade agreement which dates back to 2017. Well, it was signed in 2016 and it came into force, I think, in May 2017. And it was quite a breakthrough because Canada agreed to lift all the duties for as many as 98% of Ukrainian production. But still, and I checked this, there are just occasional, and so occasional there are almost non-existent mentions of how things are going under this agreement, of how we're cooperating in economics with Canada and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the European Union, Ukrainian media will look in detail into every and the association agreement we have with the European Union also has the FTA agreement, so that's why I'm talking about it. When it comes to the European Union, Ukrainian media will look into the tiniest detail of which quotas we have, of how many days, in how many days we exhausted quotas for each product, and so on and so forth. So there can be a perspective here about how things are perceived in Ukraine, about its being Westbound. We may be saying that we are all we are comprehensively Westbound, but there is a significant disparity between how much attention is paid to the EU and even the strongest player over the pond, which is the US. However, US is a very particular case in which I'm going to look into in a couple of minutes. So, when it comes to the European Union, I will now briefly dwell on the European Union, US, and NATO. When it comes to the European Union, it should be understood that there is this dual approach that Ukraine has formed in its relations with the West. There is this informal division that Ukraine is seeking support from the EU when it comes to reforms, and Ukraine is seeking support in security when it comes to Washington, both in the sense of the US and in the sense of NATO. So, which is why when we speak about the European Union, Ukraine's major goal is to become an EU member state, and it is one of the major things that Poroshenko did towards the end of his tenure as Ukraine's president. He said he pushed Ukraine's parliament to adopt amendments to Ukraine's constitution, that we are now under Ukraine's constitution, going towards the European Union and NATO membership. So that became something stipulated in the main law of Ukraine. So Ukraine, the major instrument around which Ukraine's relations with the European Union are evolving is the association agreement that was eventually signed by Poroshenko in 2014, and then later the economic part was signed. So Ukraine, even though formally this is not something that enables Ukraine to aspire towards EU membership, and the European Union keeps telling Ukraine that guys, this is a very ambitious thing, and yes, we like cooperating with you, but it's not membership just yet. Ukrainian officials, they very much like to position it as a stepping stone towards EU membership. And Ukraine also has a very ambitious agenda with the European Union. For instance, now that we have signed the association agreement in 2014, the agreement itself provides for a possibility to amend and to expand the agreement after the 5 years have passed by since its adoption. So, which is why in this year, in 2021, Ukraine is going to push forward and has already, by the way, received the agreement of the European Union that this is possible. We can review this agreement and we can expand it. Ukraine has also embarked upon some very ambitious projects other than the association agreement. For instance, there is the agreement that is known by the abbreviation ACAA, which is the agreement on the conformity of industrial products, broadly speaking. This is something that is being dubbed in Ukraine as the industrial visa-free regime. So Ukraine essentially wants its products to be able not to undergo additional checks, sanitary checks, industrial checks, and so on and so forth when they enter the European market. That will first of all open the EU market to Ukraine. That will create much more possibilities for Ukrainian entrepreneurs to go, and even SMEs to go to the European market. That would be a much greater competitiveness, and there is very much to talk about here. Also, there is this idea of several unions with the European Union, which is the customs union, the digital union, and one of the latest developments when the new European Commission became incumbent at the end of 2019, they said that the cornerstone of their 5-year tenure would be the so-called European Green Deal. This was kind of innovation, not green policy as such, but this scope that says that Europe will become the first climate neutral continent by 2050, and Ukraine tried to catch this opportunity just at the very outset, and this is something it is counting to benefit from very much, not just from the European deal per se, but from the very fact that it is so willing to align with the EU, to be an equal partner with the EU. So that's that. So there is the Green Deal, the industrial visa-free regime, the renewal of the association agreement that had been signed in 2014. Now, when it comes to the United States, these last 5 years, I think, have been quite tough in Ukrainian relations with the United States, and this is not because of some framework problems, but rather just to an array of and to the chain of different developments of different scandals that have one way or another way involved Ukraine. First of all, and this is some kind of a broader picture, there were two factors. The unforeseeable President Trump. He was unforeseeable not just because it is a popular thing to say about him. He was unforeseeable also because, for instance, he was seeming to be pro-Ukrainian, and then one day he tweeted something like, from what I hear, Crimeans just wanted to go for Russia, and they wanted to become a part of Russia, so what's the problem? And then all the diplomatic efforts on the part of Ukraine were good for nothing. That just all the developments that had been going on in diplomatic circles before that. Also, and this is of the utmost importance, is the fact that Ukraine is relying on the bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress because as I previously mentioned, Ukraine is relying on the U.S. support in terms of security, which means furnishing weapons to Ukraine, different machinery and so on and so forth, but also weapons. And the issue that most debates have been going on around that was furnishment of javelins. And for that to happen, and for any other allocation of arms to Ukraine, for that to happen, Ukraine needed the bipartisan support. So Ukraine needed to be very careful about its attitude towards specific personalities, towards being equally distant from both parties, and from the heated debates that there may have been in the U.S. on different issues during these 5 years between the parties. So, which is why, okay, so the bottom line, this is the major interest of Ukraine in that sense. However, even before Trump came to power, there was a scandal with the fact that suddenly media started paying attention to the fact that Ukrainian government had been consistently rooting for Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election. And of course, Trump could not like that. Of course, everybody understood that Ukraine was not impartial in its take towards the U.S. politics. Nobody, I don't think anybody accused Ukraine of being outwardly interfering the U.S. Domestic affairs. I don't think it went that far, just for that kind of thing, for that period. However, that was not, diplomatically speaking, that was not a very nice picture, especially given that Trump turned out to be the winner of that election. So that, of course, made things more complicated. Then a couple of years after, I think it was in 2017, there was a meeting between President Poroshenko and President Trump, which later turned out to be that maybe it was paid for. That maybe Poroshenko there were news that Poroshenko wanted to have a big meeting with Trump, and when I'm saying big, not just with Trump, but big for the media, so that they see the level of relations between Poroshenko and Trump. He was so willing to have that, and Trump evidently was not willing to have that kind of scope at a meeting. That Poroshenko reportedly paid from $400,000 to $600,000 to, I believe that was Michael Cohen, one of Trump's lawyers, who had not usually acted as an intermediary for Trump, reportedly, but this time he reportedly did. And of course, this tainted Ukrainian-American relations for quite a good while, especially that Trump said that he did not know anything about the payment, but Ukraine's administration chose just to refuse to comment on that, which I think it's like pleading the fifth, is you might just go forward and say that you did this, what you're being accused of. So there's that. And of course, there is the biggest issue of the recent years, which is the issue of Zelensky and his conversation with Trump, and Trump trying to push Zelensky into investigating the Burisma case against Joe Biden, which evidently, according to Trump's plan, had to undermine Biden's plans for presidency. And this scandal, it was the thing that led to Trump's first impeachment proceedings. When it comes to damage control on the Ukrainian part, I think it could have been worse, because at least the way it seemed from Ukrainian media reporting pursuant to the narratives of the foreign media, most of the foreign actors, they just said something like, okay, Zelensky is a guy that is inexperienced in politics. He may have been just used by Trump. So maybe, I mean, of course there was a conversation, but hey, he does not seem to have launched that investigation. And the very fact of the conversation, given that he was an easy target to being lured into that kind of a deal, maybe he's just not that very much guilty after all. So it seems that Zelensky did not bear that much of a cost for that, but Ukrainian-American relations certainly did. So there is that. Now one can only guess what Ukraine's relations with the US will be now that Biden is the president, because on the one hand, it seems that things may be easier, but at the same time, maybe Biden will be willing to keep a distance between Ukraine and the US, and between himself and Zelensky and Burisma case, just because he would not like to be perceived as, oh, look, they again are having close ties, just like they had in the case of Burisma. So maybe Biden would just like to keep a certain kind of distance with Ukraine, not to let another spin of that Burisma story happen again. And very briefly, just for a couple of minutes, Ukraine's relations with NATO. So there are several things to highlight here. And first of all, Ukrainians have much less unanimity on whether Ukraine should be a UN NATO member state, because this involves being a part of a military bloc, not just a political bloc. And of course, I have been citing some sociological surveys that say that Ukrainians are incrementally willing to join NATO, but still this is something about 40-something%. And this is not enough, in my opinion, to be talking about NATO accession. And on the other hand, NATO accession may not be possible just for the time being, because as we know, a thing that needs to be considered when a country is about to join NATO is that there need to be no pending conflicts in its territory. And of course, Ukraine is not the case in this sense. Formally speaking, Ukraine, due to that factor, does not have any chance to join. But Ukrainian politicians for the last, I think, 2 years, I would not be mistaken to say that, for the last 2 years have been spinning the narrative that after all, given that membership decisions are taken at the summit level, at the level of the heads of governments, this is going to be a political decision. If we convince heads of the foreign governments that Ukraine needs to be a member state of NATO and NATO would benefit from that, so maybe NATO itself would disregard the letter of the treaty, of the Washington Treaty, and admit Ukraine to membership. However, there is another problem. There have been some bilateral problems that Ukraine has been having with Hungary. It relates to educational issues and language issues with the Hungarian national minority in Ukraine, and I will not dig into that too far because of the time pressing here. However, the bottom line is that Hungary is using NATO as leverage to convince Ukraine to accept Hungary's agenda about its minority in Ukraine. So essentially, Hungary is blocking the work of the NATO-Ukraine Commission, where major decisions are being taken. So and it remains to be so it has been remained to be so for a couple of years, and it still remains to be so now. And there are no evident solution in the proximate future to be seen. And of course, otherwise, Ukraine is trying to adjust its army to NATO standards. There are trainings with the NATO instructors. There are NATO standards implemented in the Ukrainian armed forces, and so on and so forth. But other than that, any big decisions are not being taken. Ukraine acceded in 2020 to the program of extended opportunities, of enhanced opportunities, I think it goes, with NATO, which just gives Ukraine a possibility to cooperate with NATO closer when it comes to trainings, when it comes to unification of standards, and so on and so forth. But still, this is not very much about integration. This is something of an analog of an association agreement with the European Union. It is an instrument that is bringing Ukraine and the EU closer towards each other, but but the idea of the association agreement is not integration per se. This is not qualification for becoming a member. The same goes for the NATO enhanced cooperation program. This is a good step forward, but not a promise. And I'm sorry I was speaking that long, and I will make sure that if Yulia allows me, that I will compensate for the time that you may have been talking to me by my patience, and I will take as many questions as I will possibly can. So, please.
Well, Maksym, thank you for your analysis. There are many good points raised that all of us can think about. So I can see that our first question was written to the chat. Are the challenges related to Ukraine's difficulties with finding its space on the international arena caused more by the internal or the external factors?
I'm sorry for how commonplace this may sound, but this is both, essentially. There is, of course, in the domestic narrative, there is this preoccupation that there is so much opponents there are so many opponents to Ukrainian reforms, which are the bedrock of European integration, because the way that Brussels is acting towards Ukraine is the principle more for more. The more reforms you implement, the more support will provide you, the financial support, the support for the further support for the next reforms you're going to implement, and so on and so forth. However, the challenges in Ukraine for reforms are very big, unspeakably big, especially when it comes to anti-corruption reforms. For instance, even though that anti-corruption infrastructure, the majority of anti-corruption infrastructure was established in Ukraine in 2015, I think. For instance, there was this mechanism that NAZK, the National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption, would make officials fill in their electronic declarations of their assets and submit before they take their offices. So this was organized, and that mechanism worked. Even me, when I was one time applying for public service, I needed to fill out that form and to submit it. However, as of 2019, no single one, I think, of those filed declarations was checked. So yes, there is a process in place that obliges the candidates and obliges the officials, even up to the president, to fill up his declaration and to make it public. But okay, media can dig there as much as they like, because those declarations are public, in the public domain. However, there was no authority, there was no mechanism, the peer mechanism, that would check those declarations. So that it was quite good for nothing. This half-heartedness of Ukrainian reforms sometimes, when it comes to anti-corruption, is what undermines the idea of reforms sometimes at all to begin with. And for instance, just a few months back, there was a ruling of the Constitutional Court that some of the elements of the anti-corruption infrastructure that had been established in 2015, they had been anti-constitutional. And the thing was just in some formalities, that the procedure when they were established, not the idea, were impeached and something like that. But still, this was perceived as a major rollback, both domestically and by Ukraine's foreign partners, which Ukraine seems to be dealing with up to this moment. We're not sure how we're going to come out of this thing. So this is just one example of how much of resistance there is in Ukraine. But of course, the thing why I said there is both domestic and foreign, but of course there is foreign resistance. Of course, there is Russia that is pressing Ukraine through Donbas incrementally more, as Ukraine goes incrementally westbound. And that, of course, should not be underestimated too, because that's essentially about the lives of the people, about the lives of as much as 14,000 of people, both civilians and military. So, of course, there is no other way to put it that this is both. Sorry for that long explanation. Yes.
Thank you, Maksym. Our next question is, what do you think of the exclusion of Yelizaveta Yasko from the Ukrainian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe?
As far as I know the story, because I deal mostly with the foreign affairs, but as far as I know from the story, this was about some intra-factional clashes, which brings me to a bigger problem that there is with Ukraine's parliament and with the Servant of the People party, to which this story around Yasko belongs. When they were elected, the President Zelensky, he led this party to Ukraine's parliament based on his own image, based on the TV series that he had done. I think many of you are acquainted with this, are familiar with this TV series, The Servant of the People, and he wanted to see them as a very uniform power, and there was very much rejoice on the part of the Ukrainian authorities when it turned out that they did not, that the presidential party did not even need to form a coalition with anybody else, because any decision, except maybe for constitutional decisions, every decision, every law could be adopted just due to the parliamentary faction alone. But later, the so-called Turbo regime choked. Later, there began to be different groups of influence within the party, and these groups of influence were influenced by Ukrainian oligarchs, for instance, like Mr. Kolomoisky, of whom I think you all are well aware. And yes, so this Yelizaveta Yasko issue, I think it is one of the instances how these intrafactional things, how they played out on the external, how they affected external things, and this is why she was withdrawn, and this is why Ukraine needs to manage its image in the sense of how much these domestic issues influence our frontline, our diplomatic frontline abroad. Because as far as I understand, there are no viable claims to her work at her post in Strasbourg. So.
Thank you, Maksym. So our next question is, how many Ukrainians want to join the European Union, and how much is Ukraine divided on this basis? I know that you briefly spoken about this already, so maybe you could also talk a little bit about the demographics of the people that are pro-Eastern versus pro-Westerns in terms of their education and income, let's say whether they're from the cities or from the villages, and other age, other aspects like that.
Yes, I understand. So yes, first of all, I would reiterate that this, first of all, has to do with the geography. Okay, let's just have the absolute numbers first. So the absolute numbers go that as of November 2020, Ukraine, 49% of Ukrainians wanted Ukraine to accede to the European Union, to become a member state of the European Union. And I just found this information. I was earlier wondering about the NATO figure. This is 41% of people who want to join NATO. So when it comes to regions, as I said, the southern and eastern regions are less prone to the desire to go westbound than the west and the central part of Ukraine. When it comes to gender breakdown, I don't think there is any preference between them. But when it comes to age groups, I think that it would be fair to say that the majority of those wanting to remain in closer ties with the East and not to integrate into the European Union, these are the people of 45 and older. These are the people, and the older they get, the more adamant. I mean, the older the person is, yes, the more adamant he or she is in his or her reluctance to go west, because these people were brought up in the USSR. They remember a specific stance of things under which they were brought up, under which they started their work, the stability that they were very often cite when it comes to explaining their choice, their anti-Western choice. They often say that you see, there was stability, there was the confidence in the tomorrow's day, and explaining to those people that this is how the Western, the capitalistic world, the capitalism as such works, that yes, there is a certain amount of risk in the economic agenda, in the personal agenda, in the social agenda, but eventually, on average, everybody is better off if a due amount of efforts of personal efforts is paid. So yes, that would be the general picture. That the older a person is, the less willing he or she is to go to the West because of his reminiscence of the USSR. That's the major motivation by far.
Thank you, Maksym. Our next question is from Professor Konstantiuk. Do you foresee the scenario that Boycott Medvedchuk opposition party wins the next elections, either presidential or wins majority in the parliamentary elections?
No. The short answer is no, and the long answer is the following. First of all, that after the Revolution of Dignity, this is, I think, the first time in Ukraine's independence history, the modern independence history, when two different rival, but both pro-Western administrations have succeeded one another. There was the Panchenko administration, and then there is Zelensky administration. When we go back to Kuchma times, and we're not speaking about the succession of Kuchma by Kuchma, yes, we're not speaking about successive terms. We're speaking about successive different administrations. After Kuchma, there was the rather pro-Western Yushchenko. Then we had this to and fro movement, Kuchma, Yushchenko, Yanukovych, and then Poroshenko. And then the pendulum did not swing back. It remained there at the pro-Western course. So this indicates that, first of all, this is not a rule in Ukrainian politics that we are going to change every time the pro-Western and pro-Eastern courses. This is the first point. The second point, Ukrainians cannot, and certainly not in the circumstances of a war, forget about the casualties that are being inflicted by Russia. Of course, there is an amount of those who still want to cooperate with Russia. We've been dwelling on that during this conversation quite enough. However, their number is not sufficient for this to become a prevailing political force. According to the recent polls that I saw, there was information, there were these flashy headlines that if presidential elections were to be held these days, that Zelensky would have a face-off with Boycott, who is from the opposition party. However, what needs to be understood here is that the gap between them is very big. It's times big. And against this backdrop, it should be understood, we should be speaking about absolute numbers. The fact that opposition may be approaching, for instance, the European Solidarity Party, led by Poroshenko, or the Batkivshchina party, led by Tymoshenko, this fact does not mean that there is this gap from the Servant of the People party. And even if it happens so, that at the next parliamentary elections, certainly not presidential, Boyko is not going to be the president of Ukraine. If at the next parliamentary election, the Ukrainian parties are going to be so much fractured into different parliamentary factions that no single one of them is going to be a convincing majority, still they will know better than not to create a coalition against Russian forces. I think so. I'm convinced of that. Because, hey, there is the Servant of the People, which may not remain this big by the next parliamentary election, but still, there is the European Solidarity Party, there is the Hovas Party. I don't see what needs to happen between them, especially between Hovas and the Servant of the People and Hovas and Solidarity, that they will not be able to overcome their differences, no matter how big they are, than to unite against those that are associated with the war in the east of Ukraine. I'm sorry, I may be sounding pathetic, but you can check your figures at any time on that issue, and you will understand that this is something that really is the case.
Thank you, Maksym. All of us really appreciate to hear your outlooks on all of these issues. And now we have another political question. What are the major accomplishments of the President Zelensky team in your opinion? So I guess you could talk about foreign policy and other areas if you feel comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, a tough question, I would like to admit. Let me think for a minute. When it comes to foreign policy, a major achievement of Zelensky, relatively major achievement of Zelensky, and I'll explain well relatively in a second, is the revival of the normative format. This is something not too big of an accomplishment because of how protracted things are in this format, because of how long it takes to agree on certain things and to gather everybody around the table. But the breakthrough that was perceived as a breakthrough the last year, that there was a normative format meeting, that there were some certain achievements, some certain agreements achieved, the liberation of the several rounds of liberation of the most famous hostage names that Ukraine had. I mean, we're speaking about Sentsov, Panchenko, Afanasyev, and so on and so forth. So back at the time, that was perceived as a major diplomatic victory by Zelensky, and it still remains to be so. However, this track is, as I already mentioned, is very protected. The achievements when it comes to Donbass, when it comes to normative format, is not that they are not that easy. They do not come that swiftly. And when it comes to the remainder of the foreign policy, notwithstanding that Zelensky is under constitution the representative of Ukraine in foreign policy, as I previously mentioned, he is not that very much focused on the foreign policy. He said that he is going to be dedicating himself to Donbass and also to domestic agenda. And this domestic agenda, I think a year back, he was doing quite well in it. And all these ideas with digitalization and so on and so forth, he was quite successful then. However, this year, that everybody got first distracted with the pandemic, after the communication failures that Zelensky may have had and his team when it comes to the pandemic and other things. When it comes to the loss of unity of his parliamentary faction, I think in this 2020 year, Zelensky, unfortunately, I'm very sorry to admit, that did not have any major wins, unfortunately. So yes, I'm sorry to be approaching the end with that kind of sorry note, but there is nothing to admit that would be a major win at this point. Unfortunately, I need to be honest.
Okay, we have time for one more question, if anyone in the audience has any.
Hey, first to just say a great lecture. Really appreciate you taking the time, and definitely very knowledgeable about the subjects. I really appreciate it. I was just wondering, I know you've talked about some of those external factors, and certainly one of those historical, things at play is the energy dependency, especially, in response to, Russia and energy dependency and oil with that, and, pipelines that go through Ukraine with, massive fall in oil prices recently, and the included trend in green development and green energy. How do you feel that might affect kind of that long-term push between the West and then eastbound approaches due to kind of like that falling power of Russia due to the natural energy sector falling so much and the rise of green energy?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very good point, because it was a hot topic it has been a very hot topic for a very long time, and especially a year back, and I'm going to explain why. Yes, there is an issue there was an issue of Ukraine's dependence on Russian gas, and not so much even on the gas per se, but also on the gas transportation system that was used by Russia to transport gas to Europe. When it comes to Ukraine's needs in gas as a resource, for a couple of years now, and quite successfully so, Ukraine has been relying on the backhaul of gas from Europe, which essentially is the same Russian gas, but it is being bought from Europe, the residue gas, or whatever is the right word to call it. And this seems to be sufficing for Ukraine. Also, there is a number of projects that Ukraine is developing and was developing for quite a long time with the European Union. This includes such interesting projects like, for instance, building of the interconnectors between Ukraine and Poland for Ukraine to be able to receive the liquefied gas and to use it because Poland has an LNG terminal somewhere on the Baltic Sea. I believe it's in Gdansk or Vilnius. And Ukraine does not have one, unfortunately. So yes, Ukraine needs to diversify its options. But Ukraine also has had a number of wins in this sense. First of all, Ukraine had a couple of years back a major victory over Russia at the Stockholm arbitration, where it was proven right over Russia when Ukraine's Naftogaz, the state-owned company in the gas sector, was proven right over Russian Gazprom, and Ukraine received a couple of billion euros for that. Also, a year back, Ukraine needed to conclude a renewing agreement on the gas transportation through Ukraine to Europe, because the previous had expired, and everybody was very agitated because that was the time when Russia was hoping to complete its Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And at that point, if it had succeeded to do so, it would have a whole bunch of other pipelines through which it would be able to pump gas to Europe. But as you may know from the incoming news these very days, the more and more sanctions are being placed on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, notwithstanding the Angela Merkel and the German government's promotion of this pipeline. There are more and more sanctions, and what I'm driving at is that right at the moment when Ukraine feared that this would play against the renewal of the agreement, and this was essential because this transportation of gas to Europe accounts for about 2 to 3% of Ukraine's GDP. When Ukraine thought that this would be a disaster, there was this postponement, there were the sanctions, and there were, these other different factors, the opposition of the Western world, except maybe for Germany and a couple of other countries. But it still played well for Ukraine. Well, there still was a middle ground. The new agreement that was concluded, it was not concluded for 10 years. I think it was concluded for 5 years, if I'm not mistaken. But still, there was stipulated a minimum amount of gas that needs to be pumped through Ukrainian GTS. And a very important thing that we managed to stipulate in this new agreement is that earlier, under the previous agreement, Russia formally handed over its gas to Europe on Ukrainian European border, Ukrainian EU border, which made Ukraine quite invisible as an actor in this process for the European Union. And in this new agreement, things have changed. Russia is now handing over European gas to Europe, first to Ukraine. And then this already European gas is being flown through Ukraine's GTS to Europe. This is where Ukraine's intermediary part became visible, and this is what was very principal for Ukraine all along in these negotiations. And this is something that eventually happened, because it helps Ukraine increase its geopolitical role, its economic benefits, and its political victory over Russia. So, and of course, its integrational motives, because not only this is a political win that, hey guys, we're now visible, this also formally, this became possible because this process means, this new process means that Ukraine acceded to the European rules in this area, and the European rules of gas transportation, that they require that Ukraine be visible, that Ukraine is acting according to European rules of transportation. So we managed to bring ourselves closer in sense of integration to EU too. So there were quite a number of how do you say it, birds killed with one stone, something like that in English. So yes, there is that. The bottom line about your question is that Ukraine's stand in gas-related issues is these days much better, much more diversified, and much more reliable for at least mid-term vision than it used to be just a year ago. So in this sense, we're looking good, quite good as well.
Just, I suppose one last question was asked of us. Does Russian pride and desire for the power of the USSR past pose a potential fatal threat to Ukraine?
Very much so. All along, very much so. Because however the imperial, generally speaking, imperial, that's the word to call it, imperial desire of Moscow can be called. This can be the USSR restored. It can be called the, I don't know, any other name that Moscow chooses to brand it, but still it's the very same idea. The idea to have this, to incorporate this belt of nations to the west, to the east, when it comes to to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and all the chain of these states, and also the Caucasus states. In some cases, this is the matter of security, like in case of Central Asia, and also Western states, because that would be the boundary from NATO. But in some cases, like in Ukraine, this is an ambition, this is some kind of an imperial complex, because they want to prove that Ukraine does not have its sovereignty, does not have its culture, its language, and so on and so forth. So this is imposing some tough love on Ukraine. So there may be different incentives for Russia in this sense. But yes, this is a major threat to Ukraine. And essentially, what we're witnessing in Donbass, and have been doing so for the last 6 years, almost 7 years, this is just that. This is just Russian desire not to let Ukraine go for one reason or another.
Thank you, Maksym. So it's time to wrap up our today's lecture, and I'd like to thank Maksym, the QX team, and everyone who's had a chance to support us today and attend our lecture, and for all of your great questions. If you haven't yet had a chance, please follow the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies on our YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter pages. And дякую за увагу. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to get to know you even virtually, and to have an opportunity to speak about that, and to know that there is interest in the delivery of a lecture by me in the first place. I think that I will leave my contacts, my Facebook contacts, and also the contacts of the resource that I thought, as I said, would be of an interest to you, the ukrainianworld.org. We have a number, apart from the website itself, we have a number of bigger PDF products. They are free for download. These are the books called Stories from Ukraine, and there are some different other publications with the dedicated issues we're looking into. So feel free. I'll send it. I think I'll send a short list of them to Julia, and I hope she will share it with you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.